So come February 24th, it will be 2 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the anniversary coming just days after the sudden death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. European leaders are being asked hard questions about what more they can do to thwart Russian aggression and support Ukraine. For more on this, we are now joined by DW's Arthur Sullivan in Berlin. Arthur, welcome to DD India Global. So, how have European leaders reacted to the death of Alexei Navalny?
Yes, Alexei Navalny's death came as a huge shock to European leaders, even though it wasn't entirely surprising given how things have gone for various opponents of the Russian President Vladimir Putin over the years, and indeed how Navalny himself had been treated over the last period since he came back to Russia in 2021, having been poisoned before that. Now, the European leaders reacted with very clear words of condemnation for Russia. They made it very clear that they believed Vladimir Putin and the Russian state were directly responsible for Navalny's death, and they emphasized that it showed just how undemocratic and brutal the repression of the Russian state has become under Putin, and indeed since the invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago this week, as you said. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he said Navalny had paid for his courage with his life. The French President Emmanuel Macron said that the death showed that in Russia, free spirits were sent to the Gulag and condemned to death. Now, since then, the story has moved on, of course. Navalny's body has still not been released to his family. They say that this is because Russia is trying to delay things in order to cover up the true cause of Navalny's death. And Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalnaya, she met with European foreign ministers earlier this week, and she made it very clear she holds Putin responsible for her husband's death, and she urged the EU to take action.
Okay, and Arthur, what about the broader question of European financial support for Ukraine and indeed investment in its own security for the years ahead?
Well, a few weeks back, the EU agreed a 50 billion euros financial support package for Ukraine. And even though there is growing opposition from certain countries in Europe which are more closely aligned or certainly more sympathetic to Moscow's perspective, such as Hungary, the EU clearly is financially still committed to supporting Ukraine. Now, in terms of its own security, that's a different question, and that's certainly not going to go away anytime soon. So there were some recent comments, I'm sure you're aware of, from Donald Trump, where he said he would encourage Russia to attack a NATO country if it did not meet its spending commitments on security. That was greeted with horror by European leaders and in various capitals of Europe, particularly given Trump's chances of winning the US presidential election later this year. So these fears that America could pull back from its long-established, deep role in terms of overseeing security in Europe under a second Trump presidency, those fears are growing with good reason. So Europe has ramped up its arms production in the last few years. In fact, over the last decade, it's gone up, and particularly in the last 2 years since the invasion. But military and security experts say it's still nowhere near enough to make the continent able to defend itself. And just a final point on this question. European countries which are members of NATO are spending more and more on their security. So 10 years ago in 2014, just 3 NATO members met the agreed target of spending 2% of their GDP on defence. This year, 18 countries are going to hit it, so things have got better. But here's the thing. For a long time, this question was simply non-existent. It was dormant. It wasn't asked anymore. And that is no longer the case. In fact, it's probably at a more critical point and a more pertinent question than at any stage since the Cold War. And given what we saw last week in Russia, given what's happening every day in Ukraine, this question is only going to get bigger.
Indeed. Thank you, Arthur. Arthur Sullivan joining us from Deutsche Welle.